Black veteran orders a simple meal. Waitress whispers something that leaves him frozen. A black Vietnam veteran walks into a small-town diner, just wanting a quiet steak dinner. But when the waitress leans in and whispers something, he freezes. Jaw open, eyes wide. What she says takes him back 50 years. Like, share, and subscribe, because this is a story that will break your heart and heal it too. Let's begin. It was a peaceful Tuesday afternoon in a small southern town, the kind of place where the days pass slowly and the faces are familiar. Inside Dixie Diner, the scent of sizzling bacon and grilled onions filled the air. The clinking of silverware and soft chatter gave the place its usual warm hum. The door opened with a gentle ding. Heads turned slightly but quickly looked away. An elderly black man walked in, calm, proud, and quietly dressed in a red flannel shirt and a worn cap that read Vietnam veteran. His steps were slow but firm, the kind of walk that held stories no one dared to ask about. His name was Henry Walker, and he had served in the U.S. Army for 22 years. He had seen war, seen brothers fall, and returned to a country that once refused to serve him coffee at the very table he now sat down at. But today was just about steak. Just a good hot meal. He found a quiet booth near the window, the sunlight stretching across the polished wooden table. He placed his hat gently beside him and leaned back with a sigh. His eyes scanned the room, but no one really looked at him. That was fine. He wasn't here for company. Moments later, a young waitress walked over. She was in her 20s, blonde ponytail bouncing slightly as she approached with a pen and pad. Her name tag read Cassie. She greeted him with a bright smile, though her eyes lingered on the Vietnam veteran cap a second longer than most would notice. "Hi there, sir. Welcome to Dixie Diner," she said warmly. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Henry smiled politely and replied, "Just some sweet tea, please. And I'll have the steak medium well. No mushrooms." Cassie nodded, writing quickly. "Coming right up." She turned, but before she walked away completely, she paused. Her expression shifted, like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she should. Henry noticed but didn't press. 10 minutes passed. He sat quietly, watching the world outside the window. Children rode bikes down the sidewalk. A mother with groceries in her arms waved to someone across the street. Everything seemed normal. Calm. Cassie returned with his plate: steak, collard greens, fries, and a tall glass of iced tea. She gently set it down, but as she did, she leaned in closer. Henry looked up, thinking she might have forgotten something, but instead she placed her hand near her mouth and whispered just a few quiet words. And in that moment, something in his face changed. His hand holding the glass paused in midair. His eyes didn't blink. His lips parted just slightly, but he didn't say a word. Cassie straightened her face, now serious, almost emotional. "Enjoy your meal, Mr. Walker," she said softly, then walked away. Henry sat frozen, not because of the food, not because of pain, but because of what she had whispered. Words he hadn't heard in over 50 years, words he never thought he'd hear again. Henry Walker didn't move, not even a twitch. His fork rested beside the steaming plate. The glass of sweet tea was still in his hand, halfway between the table and his mouth, but his mind had traveled far years back, to a time when the world was louder, harsher, and filled with gunfire and pain. The words Cassie whispered echoed in his head. "My grandfather said you saved his life. In Da Nang." That name, Da Nang, a place he hadn't spoken of in decades. The memory hit him like a wave. Henry was 24 back then, a young sergeant, leading a squad through dense jungle. The enemy was closing in, and panic spread through the group like wildfire. One of his men, a white boy from Georgia, scared out of his mind, froze behind a tree while bullets flew overhead. The others shouted, but he wouldn't move. Henry had turned back, against orders, crawled through mud and blood, and dragged that boy out with bullets biting the dirt behind them. He never even learned the man's name. Until now. Cassie. Her soft voice still rang in his ears. "My grandfather never forgot you. He described you perfectly. The hat, the calm way you sit, your walk. He told me if I ever saw you I should thank you." Henry slowly set his glass down. He turned his head slightly to look at her. She was at the counter, pretending to clean menus, but her eyes glanced his way more than once. Her hands were shaking a little. He picked up his fork and took a bite. Though the taste didn't register, all he could think was, how could this young woman, born long after the war, know who he was? After a few moments, he stood up. He walked over to the counter, still quiet, holding his glass. Cassie turned around, startled. Before she could say anything, Henry spoke. "What's your grandfather's name?" Her lips curled into a soft smile, almost trembling. "George Harlan. He's 82 now, lives out by the lake. Still tells the story like it happened yesterday," he said. "A black soldier. Saved him when no one else would. When others ran, you didn't." Henry's eyes welled up, not from pride, but from the simple fact that someone remembered, that someone told the story. He nodded slowly, a lump in his throat. "I remember him. Scrawny white boy, shaking so hard I thought he'd rattle apart." Cassie laughed softly, her eyes bright with emotion. "That's him." Henry stood quietly for a second, then asked, "Does he know you're here?" Cassie shook her head. "No, he doesn't know I've met you, but he talks about you like you're a ghost. A hero who disappeared after the war. He always wondered If you made it home okay. Henry chuckled faintly. Barely. But yeah, I made it. Cassie looked down, then back up with tears forming. He told me if I ever met you, I should say thank you for saving his life, for giving me a grandfather, for giving my dad a father. Henry's hands shook slightly as he reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, faded photograph, the only thing he always kept in his wallet. It showed a group of soldiers, dirty, tired, but smiling in the jungle. He pointed at one young man in the background. That's him, George. I remember that day we had just made it out alive. Cassie gasped. You kept this all these years? Henry nodded slowly because it was the only day we smiled. The restaurant had gone quiet. A few nearby customers were listening now, pretending not to, but their eyes were glued to the two people at the counter. And in that diner, time seemed to pause. One whisper from a young waitress had turned a quiet lunch into something sacred, something unforgettable. Henry looked at her one more time. Thank you, Cassie, not just for what you said, but for remembering. She smiled, brushing away a tear. Thank you, Mr. Walker, for coming home. Henry Walker returned to his booth, his plate still warm, but everything felt different now. His hands didn't shake. From age they shook, from memory. It had been so long since anyone even mentioned Da Nang, and now a stranger had reached across time to remind him of who he once was. As he picked at his steak, the waitress Cassie walked toward him again, this time without her notepad or tray. Her shift seemed to fade into the background. She stood beside the booth, nervous but determined. Mr. Walker, can I ask you something strange? Henry looked up and smiled kindly. Strange doesn't scare me. Go ahead. She sat down across from him, just for a moment. The manager at the counter raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. There was something different about this conversation, something sacred. Would you be willing to come meet my grandfather? Henry blinked. That, he didn't expect George. He's still alive, you said. She nodded eagerly. He talks about you all the time. He even has a photo of your squad, same one you showed me. He's in a wheelchair now, but his memory is sharp as ever. He'd lose his mind if he knew you were real. Henry laughed softly, his first real laugh in days. People think we fade away after the war. They forget we're real. Cassie looked serious. I didn't, and I don't want him to forget either. Henry looked down at his plate, then back at her. All right, I'll come. Cassie's face lit up like a child on Christmas morning. Really? He lives 15 minutes away. Can we go after my shift? I get off at 4. Henry smiled. I'll be right here. Just tell me when. The hours passed slowly. Henry finished his meal, but he didn't leave. He sat quietly, sipping sweet tea, watching the sunlight move across the window. Customers came and went. Some nodded at him, some ignored him, but Cassie checked in on him every 20 minutes, bringing fresh tea and warm smiles. At 4:05 p.m. she came out of the kitchen, no longer in her uniform. She wore a denim jacket, jeans, and a nervous look on her face. You ready? She asked. Henry stood, stretching gently. I was born ready. Let's go see an old friend. They drove through winding back roads past small farms and rolling fields. Cassie told stories about her childhood, how her grandfather used to carry her on his shoulders, how he'd sit on the porch and hum army tunes. She never really understood his past. Until today. They reached a small wooden house by the lake. A big American flag waved gently on the front porch. Wind chimes sang quietly in the breeze. Cassie parked the car. He's always out back this time of day, watching the lake. Henry followed her slowly, his knees aching but his spirit strong. Behind the house sat an old man in a worn-out chair, a blanket over his legs, and binoculars hanging around his neck. He was staring out at the still water, peaceful and content. Grandpa, Cassie called gently. The man turned, his eyes focused slowly. He saw Cassie, and then saw the man behind her. He dropped the binoculars. They hit the wooden deck with a soft clatter. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Henry stepped forward, tipping his hat. Hello, George. Tears began to spill from the old man's eyes. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't let him so. Henry walked closer, knelt beside him and took his hand. It's been a long time, soldier, George whispered through broken breath. I thought you were gone. Henry smiled. Not yet. The two men sat together in silence for a moment. Then George reached out, trembling fingers brushing the shoulder of Henry's flannel shirt. You saved my life, Henry. I've told that story 1,000 times, but no one believed me. I never even got to say thank you. Henry squeezed his hand. You just did. Cassie stood behind them, watching with wide, wet eyes. Two men who had shared a battlefield, now sharing peace, a bond stronger than time. George looked up at his granddaughter. How did you find him? She laughed softly. He came in for steak, as Henry sat by George's side, watching the soft ripples on the lake. The silence between them spoke louder than any words ever could. Two old soldiers, once caught in the chaos of war, now reunited by a single whisper in a diner decades later. George reached slowly for a small wooden box resting on a nearby table. With trembling hands, he opened it and pulled out a folded letter, yellowed with time, and a medal wrapped in cloth. He handed them both to Henry. I kept these for you, he said, his voice breaking. The army sent them to me by mistake after the battle. I tried to return them, but I didn't know where you'd gone. I promised myself, if I ever saw you again, I'd give them back." Henry took the medal with wide eyes. It was his bronze star. The letter, written by their commanding officer, praised Henry for heroic bravery under fire and saving lives beyond the call of duty. Henry stared at it for a long time, then slowly pressed it to his chest. "I thought this was lost forever," he whispered. "So did I," George said with a smile. "But some things find their way home." As the sun began to set, painting the lake in golden light, Cassie brought out sweet tea for both men, placing a hand gently on Henry's shoulder. The three of them sat there, past, present, and future, all connected by one act of courage and one simple meal. Before leaving, Henry turned to George. "You told her about me. You kept my story alive." George nodded. "You saved my life. I made sure no one forgot yours." Cassie walked Henry to the car, but before he stepped in, he turned to her and said, "You brought me back to life today, child. Not with words, but with heart. Thank you." As she watched him drive off, the cap still proudly on his head and the letter on the seat beside him, Cassie smiled through her tears. One meal, one whisper, one veteran, and a story that would now never be forgotten.